Chapter 1. The World's Decay. The earth had become a canvas of ruin, painted in shades of greed and violence. Where fields once bore fruit, now only the thorny weeds of corruption grew tall. In the cities, the air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of fear and the unending clamor of cruelty. Humanity, once shaped with purpose, had twisted itself into a grotesque mockery of its original design. Men hoarded wealth with grasping hands, their hearts hardened to the suffering they caused, their laughter echoing not with joy, but with the hollow ring of mockery. The weak were trampled underfoot, and the cries of the oppressed rose like a foul incense toward the heavens, a constant testimony to the world's descent. From the silent, star-dusted reaches beyond the sky, a profound sorrow watched this unfolding spectacle. The divine gaze, which had once beheld the pristine beauty of creation with delight, now witnessed a heart-sickness that had infected every corner of the world, the laws woven into the fabric of life. Compassion, justice, reverence were treated as worthless trifles, torn and discarded. Every thought of every heart seemed bent only on evil, a relentless tide of wickedness that left no soul untouched. The decision, when it came, was not born of rage, but of a deep, grieving love that could no longer abide the self-inflicted poison. The course was set. The world, for all its noise and pride, had doomed itself. Yet, in the midst of this sprawling decay, a single point of light held firm. On the outskirts of a village whose name was synonymous with vice, a man named Noah tended his land. His hands, calloused from honest labor, were not stained with the blood of his fellows. His home, a simple structure of wood and stone, stood as a quiet rebuke to the gilded halls of the corrupt. While others reveled in the darkness, Noah would rise before the sun, his figure a solitary silhouette against the fading night, as he knelt in prayer. His voice, a soft murmur lost to the wind, was a thread of purity in the polluted air, a constant plea for mercy in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. He walked a path of righteousness, not for reward, but because it was the only path his soul recognized, a lone beacon in the gathering storm. Chapter 2. A Righteous Man. The dawn found Noah already on his knees, the cool, damp earth a familiar altar. His prayers were not loud petitions, but a quiet, steady communion, a weaving of his spirit with the divine in hushed moments before the world awoke. This was the anchor of his day, the unshakable ritual that centered him in a reality far removed from the chaos festering beyond his fields. As the first sliver of sun gilded the horizon, he rose, his movements deliberate and calm, a man entirely at peace with his purpose. His integrity was not a performance, but the very substance of his being, evident in the straight furrows he plowed in his field and the sturdy walls of his homestead. While other men measured their worth in stolen coin and fleeting power, Noah's wealth was counted in the health of his vines, the strength of his sons, and the unwavering faith that illuminated his heart. His work was a form of worship. Each swing of the axe, each tended plant, an offering of a life lived in alignment with a sacred order. He moved through his day with a quiet dignity that stood in stark contrast to the frantic, grasping energy of the age. As the sun climbed higher, his family stirred, their presence a testament to the unity he had nurtured. His wife moved with a grace born of shared burdens and shared faith, her hands as capable in the garden as they were in soothing a worried brow. She was his partner in all things, her own quiet strength a perfect complement to his, their lives a single harmonious thread woven through the years. Then came his sons, Shem, with his thoughtful eyes and a mind inclined toward contemplation, Ham, whose strong back and quick hands were a boon to any labor, and Japheth, whose youthful energy was tempered by a deep-seated respect for his father. Together, they formed a bulwark of shared values, a small kingdom of righteousness in an empire of decay. In the evening, gathered around a simple meal, the true character of the family shone. There was no talk of the violence that stained the nearby towns, no envy for the ill-gotten gains of their neighbors. Instead, their conversations were of the land, of the mysteries of the stars, and of the subtle, guiding hand they all felt in their lives. Noah would watch his sons, his heart swelling with a profound gratitude for their steadfast spirits. In their faces, he saw not just his own legacy, but a flicker of the world as it was meant to be, a world built on honor, mutual respect, and a reverence for the Creator. Alone, in the deep quiet of the night, while his family slept, Noah would sometimes stand at his door and look out at the darkened world. The distant sounds of revelry and conflict were a somber reminder of the chasm that separated his household from the rest of humanity. He felt the weight of his solitude not as a burden of loneliness, but as a solemn responsibility. He reflected on the divine will, sensing a great, sorrowful purpose moving through creation, and wondered with a humble heart what role a simple, righteous man might be called to play in the unfolding story of a broken world. Chapter 3. The Voice of God. The vision did not arrive with thunder or a rending of the sky, but in the profound stillness of a dream, a clarity so sharp it felt more real than the wakened world. One moment, Noah was submerged in the formless depths of sleep, and the next, he stood on a vast empty plain under a sky bruised with the colors of a dying sun. A presence, immense and ancient, filled the space around him not as a shape or a sound, but as a weight of absolute knowledge that pressed upon his soul. It was a voice that spoke without words, a command etched directly into the fabric of his being, and the message it carried was one of cataclysm. The earth, God revealed, was a vessel of corruption, its every breath a sigh of violence. The beautiful, teeming life upon it had become a festering wound, and the time for healing had passed. A great cleansing was necessary, a flood of waters that would rise from the deep and fall from the heavens, scouring the land until every trace of the wickedness that defiled it was washed away. All life, all breath, all the noise and pride of man would be swallowed by the deluge. A primal fear, cold and sharp, seized Noah's heart. He saw in his mind's eye the towering waves, the relentless rain, the terrified final moments of a world judged and found wanting. He felt the awesome, terrifying power of a Creator who could unmake what he had made, and he trembled, a single, insignificant man standing before a source of all judgment. Then, the focus of the divine voice shifted, narrowing from the entire world to the man himself. In the midst of the coming annihilation, a single, impossible task was given. Noah was to build. He was to construct a vast ark, a vessel of salvation, a floating refuge in the heart of the storm. The purpose was twofold: to preserve his own family, the last remnant of righteousness, and to save a chosen pair of every living creature, a seed of life from which a new world could sprout from the mud of the old. The initial terror that had gripped Noah began to transmute, warmed by the ember of a sacred purpose. The awe remained, a humbling recognition of the power he faced, but it was now joined by a burgeoning sense of resolve. The command was impossible, absurd, yet it was given, and in its giving it became the only possible path forward. His fear was not erased, but it was conquered by a deeper, more powerful force, obedient faith. When he awoke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the window of his chamber. The world outside looked the same trees, the same songs of the morning birds, but everything was irrevocably altered. The weight of the vision clung to him, a tangible mantle of responsibility. He rose, his movements slow and deliberate, and sought out his wife. He found her by the hearth, stoking the fire for the morning meal. He took her hands in his, their roughness a familiar comfort, and he told her of the voice in the night, of the flood and the ark. Her eyes, usually so calm and sure, widened with a mixture of dread and wonder. But she did not pull away. She saw the truth of it etched into the lines of his face, the unshakable certainty in his gaze. Her faith, which had always walked in step with his, now rose to meet this monumental task. Later, he gathered his sons. Shem, Ham, and Japheth listened in stunned silence as their father recounted the divine mandate. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. A boat of such impossible dimensions, built on dry land, for a flood in a world that knew only sun and dust. Japheth, ever the pragmatist, first thought of the immense labor, the countless trees to be felled and shaped. Ham's mind raced with the logistics, the sheer physical reality of such a construction. Shem, the contemplative one, felt the profound theological shudder, the awe and the terror of a God who would preserve them while judging all others. A discussion bloomed among them, not of doubt, but of duty. They questioned not the command itself, but their capacity to fulfill it. Their father's calm resolve was the anchor that held them fast. He spoke not of his own strength, but of the one who had issued the call, and in that they found their answer. The family's shared values, once a quiet defense against a corrupt world, were now forged in the fire of revelation into a single, unbreakable instrument of divine will. The discussion ended where it began, with a silent, unified acceptance. The path was set, and they would walk it together. Chapter 4. Blueprints of Salvation. The divine instructions did not fade like the memory of a dream, but remained etched upon Noah's mind with the clarity of stone carvings. In the quiet of his workroom, the scent of cedar dust and old parchment hanging in the air, he unrolled a fresh sheet of leather and began to transcribe the celestial blueprint. His hand, steady despite the tremor in his soul, moved with a meticulous precision, each line a testament to the overwhelming specificity of the vision. The numbers themselves felt sacred, their proportions echoing a harmony lost to the world. 437 cubits in length, a city block of a vessel. 73 cubits in breadth, a stable foundation for the chaos to come. 44 cubits in height, a tower reaching not for pride, but for preservation. These were not the rough dimensions of a river barge, but the measured geometry of a floating mountain, a world in miniature designed to weather the end of all things. The materials were specified with the same exacting detail. Gopher wood, a resinous timber known for its strength and resistance to rot, was to be the skeleton of this great beast. Noah could almost smell its sharp, clean scent, could feel the heft of a felled trunk in his hands. Every plank, every beam was to be covered inside and out with a layer of pitch, a black, viscous tar that would seal the seams against the relentless pressure of the deep. The image was one of absolute impermeability, a box of wood and tar made watertight by divine command. The internal structure was just as deliberate, three distinct decks, layered like the strata of the earth to separate the teeming life it would carry. And within those decks, a labyrinth of compartments, countless rooms and pens designed to house a breathing, livis cargo from the mightiest bull to the smallest field mouse. This was not merely a boat. It was a mobile ecosystem, a lifeboat for creation itself. As Noah's stylus scratched across the leather, his sons gathered around the table, their faces illuminated by a single oil lamp. Shem leaned in, his brow furrowed as he traced the lines with a finger, his mind grappling with the sheer scale. Ham, his strong arms crossed, calculated the weight, the stress points, the immense foundations that would be required to support such a structure on dry ground. Japheth, younger and quicker, began sketching smaller diagrams of the compartment layouts, his mind already organizing the chaos of the coming menagerie. Their initial awe gave way to a focused, practical energy. They spoke in low, urgent tones of the forests of cypress and cedar that grew to the north, of the vast quantities of pitch that would need to be harvested and rendered, of the quarries where stone for tools and foundations could be found. The discussion was a web of logistics, a human attempt to map a divine plan onto the physical world. Noah listened, his own notes complete, his heart swelling with a profound trust. The task was impossible by any human measure. The resources were staggering, the labor Herculean, the timeline a mystery. Yet as he watched his sons, their faces a mixture of determination, confusion, and burgeoning faith, he felt not fear, but a quiet certainty. The precision of the instructions was not a burden, but a gift. Every measurement, every material specification was a stepping stone placed by a guiding hand. His role was not to question the architect, but to follow the blueprint with unwavering fidelity. The gathering of the first materials, the selection of the first trees, the first pots of boiling pitch would be the initial acts of a long obedience, a physical manifestation of trust in a salvation whose form was now laid out before them, not as a vague promise, but as a detailed, tangible plan. Chapter 5. The First Hammer Blow. The first swing of the axe was a declaration of war against the world's disbelief. The blade, honed to a razor's edge, bit deep into the trunk of a towering cypress, and the sound it made was not just the crack of wood, but the shattering of normalcy. Chips of fragrant pale wood flew through the sunlit air, each one a piece of Noah's old life fallen away. His muscles, hardened by a lifetime of tilling soil and tending vines, now strained with a new monumental purpose. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracing paths through the dust as he worked with a rhythmic, relentless intensity. This was no longer the quiet farmer praying in his field. This was a builder, answering a call that defied all reason, his faith made manifest in the raw physical act of felling a giant. His sons joined him, their initial awe quickly tempered by the grueling reality of the work. Shem, thoughtful and precise, learned to read the grain of the wood, guiding the saws that would strip the great logs of their bark. His hands, more accustomed to holding a stylus, grew raw and blistered, but he did not falter, his mind seeing the divine geometry in every cut. Ham, with his broad shoulders and immense strength, took up the maul in wedges, splitting the massive trunks into manageable beams. The thunderous reports of his labor echoed across the valley, a stark, percussive counterpoint to the world's usual hum. Japheth, agile and keen-eyed, scaled the rough-barked giants, securing ropes and directing the slow, groaning descent of each felled monarch. Under their father's quiet instruction, they were not just laborers. They were apprentices in a sacred craft, their education written in calluses and a scent of fresh-cut timber. As the first great beams were hauled to the chosen site, a vast, flat plain far from any water, the mockery began. It started as whispers, then grew into open jeers. Men from the nearby towns, their faces twisted with derision and too much wine, would gather at the edge of the worksite. They pointed at the skeletal beginnings of the ark's keel, a ridiculously long spine laid out on the dry, cracked earth, and laughed until they wept. They called Noah a madman, a sun-addled fool building a ship in a desert. They mocked his sons as dupes, wasting their youth on an old man's delusion. Their words were like darts, meant to pierce and poison, and they hung in the air, a toxic mist of scorn. Noah heard them, but the sound seemed distant, filtered through the overwhelming clarity of his purpose. He would pause, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm, his gaze passing over the mocking crowd without malice or fear. He saw not enemies, but souls already drowning in a flood of their own making, their laughter a desperate shield against a truth they refused to see. His perseverance was not a stubborn refusal to listen, but a profound understanding that their ridicule was part of the cost. Obedience to the divine voice meant becoming a spectacle, a byword for insanity. He would simply turn back to his work, his hammer rising and falling in a steady rhythm, each blow a quiet, defiant prayer. The cost of his obedience was measured not in gold or labor, but in the isolation of being the only man who could hear the coming thunder while the world basked in a fall sun. His faith was no longer a private devotion. It was a public act of construction, a fortress he was building not with stones of argument, but with beams of gopher wood and the unshakable conviction that the rain would indeed come. Chapter 6. Mockery and Faith. The ark's skeleton rose from the plains like the rib cage of some impossible beached leviathan, its sheer scale becoming a spectacle that drew the curious and the contemptuous from miles around. What had begun as scattered jeers from drunken passers-by swelled into a daily carnival of derision. Crowds now gathered with the regularity of patrons at a theater, their faces alight with cruel amusement at the sight of the massive vessel taking form on ground baked hard by a relentless sun. They came with baskets of food and skins of wine, making a picnic of their mockery, their laughter rolling across the construction site like a foul wave. They pointed at the soaring frames, the incomprehensible dimensions, and shouted names that hung in the air. Madman, fool, sun-struck lunatic building a navy for a world of dust. Noah worked through the noise, his body a study in focused endurance. The taunts were a constant buzzing static, but they could not penetrate the core of his resolve. One afternoon, as the crowd was particularly raucous, he laid down his adze and walked toward them. A hush fell, not of respect, but of anticipation for a new joke. He stood before them, his clothes stained with pitch and sweat, his face etched with a profound and weary gravity. He did not shout back their insults. Instead, he spoke with a voice that was low yet carried, a river of sorrow cutting through their shallow mirth. He warned them of the coming flood, of the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven, of a judgment that would wash the world clean of its corruption. He pleaded with them to see the ark not as a folly, but as a sign, an invitation to repentance and a chance for salvation. For a moment, his words seemed to hang in the air, a stark, sobering truth. Then a single snicker broke the silence, and it was all the permission the crowd needed. Their laughter erupted anew, louder and more vicious than before. They doubled over, clutching their sides, tears of mirth streaming down their faces. The idea of a flood was the most hilarious thing they had ever heard. They mocked his God, they mocked his prophecy, and they mocked the very notion that their vibrant, sun-drenched world of feasts and fights could ever be undone by mere water. They turned their backs on him, their disbelief a wall as solid and impenetrable as the mountains in the distance, and wandered off, still laughing, back to their lives of violence and vice. Noah watched them go, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. He felt no anger, only a deep, abiding grief for the chasm that separated his reality from theirs. He returned to the ark, and the sound of his hammer striking wood was an answer more eloquent than any argument. His faith was not a fragile thing to be shattered by mockery. It was the bedrock upon which the entire impossible structure was being built. It was a faith that saw the coming storm in a cloudless sky, that heard the roar of the deluge in the utter silence of God's command. His unwavering conviction became a silent sermon, preached in resin and timber, a testament that needed no words to be understood by the divine. His sons, working alongside him, absorbed the scene in their own ways. Shem watched the retreating crowd with a philosopher's sorrow, understanding that their laughter was the sound of a chosen doom. He felt his own faith solidify, transforming from a belief in his father's vision to a personal, unshakable knowledge of the coming truth. Ham, his muscles coiling with a protective fury, channeled his anger into his labor, driving pegs and heaving beams with a new, fierce intensity. The mockery did not plant seeds of doubt in him, but rather watered the seeds of a fierce familial loyalty and a grim determination to see the work through. Japheth, younger and more impressionable, initially felt the sting of the ridicule, his cheeks burning with shame. But watching his father's serene perseverance, the shame melted away, replaced by a swelling pride. He saw the contrast between the hollow laughter of the crowd and the profound, purposeful silence of his family, and his own resolve crystallized. They were not just building a boat, they were forging an ark of faith in a world drowning in disbelief, and their growing resolve was the tar that would seal its seams against the coming flood. Chapter 7. Family Unity. While the men's world was one of timber and sweat, of rising frames and the echoing blows of hammers, the women's domain was one of quiet, sustaining order. Noah's wife moved through the bustling camp with a calm authority that seemed to smooth the rough edges of their monumental task. Her hands, never still, were a blur of purposeful motion, sorting grains, measuring pulses, and overseeing the preservation of mountains of food that would need to last an unknowable length of time. She directed her daughters-in-law with a gentle firmness, their shared labor a symphony of efficiency. They wove baskets from reeds to store the dried fruits and salted meats, sealed clay pots of oil and honey, and inspected every stitch of the clothing and blankets being prepared, Their work was a bulwark against the coming chaos, a meticulous preparation for a life of confinement, and in their shared purpose, they found a strength that was both practical and profound. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of fire and gold, the relentless industry of the day would soften into the gentle rhythm of evening. The sounds of construction gave way to the crackle of the central cook fire and the soothing hiss of a stew pot. The family would gather on mats spread near the ark's immense shadow, their bodies weary, but their spirits drawn together by the simple, sacred act of a shared meal. The air filled with the aroma of lentils and herbs, of fresh-baked flatbread, a humble feast that felt like a king's banquet after a day of toil. In these moments, the ark was not a burden or a sign of coming cataclysm, but the heart of their home, the focal point around which their lives and their salvation were built. Noah would lead them in prayer, his voice a low, steady river of gratitude and supplication. He gave thanks for food, for their health, for the strength to continue, and for the divine hand that guided them. He prayed for the animals soon to arrive, for the preservation of life, and for the courage to face the unknown. These prayers were not rote recitations, but the vital cords that bound them to their God and to one another, reinforcing their shared destiny. In the circle of flickering firelight, with the vast silent stars beginning to pepper the heavens above the ark's half-built form, the family's unity felt as solid and real as the gopher wood itself. Yet, even in this fortress of faith, whispers of doubt sometimes found cracks in the darkness. One of the daughters-in-law, her hands resting on her still flat belly, voiced the quiet terror that sometimes gripped her in the night. The fear of the endless water, the claustrophobia of the sealed ark, the profound loneliness of being the only women left in a drowned world. Her questions hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as a confession of human frailty. Noah's wife did not dismiss her fears. Instead, she spoke of the promise, of the rainbow that must follow the storm, of the new earth that awaited them on the other side of judgment. She reminded them that their role was not passive. They were the keepers of the future, the bearers of the seed from which nations would spring. Their duty in managing the home, in preserving the supplies, in maintaining the morale, was as crucial to salvation as the driving of a single nail. Their faith, she showed them, was not the absence of fear, but a choice to trust in the midst of it. As the final beams were set in place and the last seams sealed with pitch, a new kind of preparation began. Under the women's direction, the family started readying the ark's interior for its living cargo. They spread deep layers of clean straw in the countless compartments, filled stone troughs that would serve as watering holes, and stacked great bundles of hay and fodder in the storage areas. The empty pens, waiting in silent anticipation, were a tangible promise of the miracle to come. This final practical work was imbued with a sense of awe, a recognition that they were preparing a home not just for themselves, but for all the breathing, beating heart of a creation deemed worthy of a second chance. The thematic thread of collective duty was woven through every action, every prayer, every shared meal, binding them together not just as a family, but as partners in a divine rescue, with the women's quiet, steadfast labor proven to be the very mortar that held the stones of their salvation firmly in place. Chapter 8. Gathering the Beasts. The first sign was not a sound, but a tremor in the air, a subtle shift in the wind that carried the scent of damp earth and distant wilderness. Then, from the shimmering horizon, they came, not in a chaotic stampede, but in a solemn, purposeful procession that defied all natural instinct. A pair of lions, their tawny coats rippling over powerful muscles, padded side by side across the plain, their regal heads held high, their eyes holding neither hunger nor fear, but a profound ancient knowing. Behind them came elephants, their colossal feet falling with soft, earth-shaking thuds, their trunks swaying in a gentle rhythm. Then deer with branching antlers, oxen with patient eyes, and creatures whose shapes and colors Noah had never imagined, drawn from the deepest jungles and the highest mountains. They moved as if pulled by an invisible thread, a current of divine will flowing counter to the world's decay, all converging on the solitary ark. Noah and his family watched, their tools forgotten in their hands, their breath caught in their throats. This was the moment the abstract command became breathtakingly, terrifyingly real. The awe they felt was a physical pressure in their chests, a humbling recognition of the staggering diversity and intricate beauty of the creation they were tasked to preserve. Shem stood transfixed, his mind reeling at the theological wonder of it, the unclean animals arriving in single pairs, the clean beasts coming in sevens, a perfect living arithmetic of divine provision and future sacrifice. Ham's practical mind immediately began calculating space, fodder, water, his eyes scanning the endless lines of creatures and mentally fitting them into the labyrinthine compartments. Japheth felt a surge of wild joy mixed with trepidation, his heart aching at the sight of a mother bear gently nudging her cub forward, of eagles circling high above before alighting on the ark's ridgepole. The logistics were a symphony of controlled chaos. The family worked from dawn until the deep purple of twilight, their movements guided by an instinct that felt both their own and divinely inspired. Noah, with a calm authority that seemed to soothe the most skittish of creatures, directed the flow of life into the ark. The great beasts were guided to the larger stalls on the lower deck, their immense strength contained by timber walls that suddenly felt frighteningly fragile. The smaller animals, the pairs of foxes, rabbits, and countless birds with plumage like living jewels, were carefully carried to the upper decks, their enclosures filled with straw and branches to mimic their natural habitats. The sons, their muscles straining, hauled great bundles of hay and lowered buckets into newly dug wells to fill the stone watering troughs. The daughters-in-law moved through the narrow passageways with baskets of grain and fruit, their gentle hands calming nervous creatures and ensuring every pair was settled. A profound theme of stewardship settled over the frantic work. This was not merely about storage or survival. It was an act of guardianship, a sacred trust. As Noah laid a hand on the warm, breathing flank of a great bull, he felt the weight of that trust. He was not just saving his family. He was shepherding the very breath of creation, the genetic library of a world about to be wiped clean. The harmony of the scene, despite its overwhelming scale, was palpable. The lowing of cattle mingled with the chirping of crickets, the scent of lion and lamb and cedar wood and hay weaving together into a strange new perfume. Predator and prey stood placidly in adjacent pens, the ancient laws of tooth and claw suspended by a greater law. In that moment, the ark was not a prison, but a sanctuary, a floating garden where the original peace of Eden seemed, for a fleeting time, restored. The gathering of the beasts was the final magnificent proof that their labor had not been in vain, a living tapestry of grace being drawn into the safety of the ark as the last sliver of sun dipped below a world that had already been judged. Chapter 9. The final call. The ark stood complete, a monstrous silhouette against the sky, its tarred hull gleaming like a black pearl under a sun that felt increasingly like a lie. The last animal, a pair of doves, had been settled into their rooftop cote, their soft cooing the final note in a symphony of preparation. A profound, expectant hush fell over the plain, broken only by the wind sighing through the ark's cavernous door, still open like a gaping mouth. Noah felt the weight of that silence, a pressure building in the air, in the earth, in his own bones. He knew, with a certainty that was both a gift and a burden, that the time for building was over. Now was the time for the final desperate plea. He walked away from the ark, his steps slow and heavy, not toward the nearby towns, but to a rocky outcrop that overlooked the main trade road, a river of humanity, still flowing with its commerce and corruption. He did not dress as a king or a prophet, but in his simple, pitch-stained tunic, a living testament to the work he had completed. As travelers and merchants passed, their carts laden with goods and their minds with petty schemes, Noah raised his voice. It was not the shout of a madman, but the raw, torn cry of a grieving father for children who would not listen. He preached of the violence that stained their hands, the greed that hollowed their souls, and the corruption that had become their creed. He pointed back to the ark, not as his own achievement, but as God's final, tangible offer of mercy. He called for repentance, for a turning away from the path of self-destruction, his words weaving a tapestry of impending judgment and the narrow, open door of salvation. The responses were a study in the many shades of spiritual death. Some met his words with a new, sharper edge of mockery, their laughter now tinged with a nervous cruelty. They threw clods of dirt and stones, not just at him, but toward the ark itself, as if they could defile the promise of salvation with their contempt. Others displayed a more profound, chilling indifference. They glanced at the massive vessel, shrugged, and continued on their way, their eyes already moving to the next transaction, the next pleasure, the next quarrel. The ark and the man preaching beside it were merely curiosities, interruptions in the rhythm of a life they assumed was eternal. They were not angry or amused. They were simply utterly uninterested, their hearts shielded by a wall of mundane concerns that the coming cataclysm could not penetrate. Amidst the crowd, Shem saw faces he recognized, boys he had wrestled with in the dust, young men with whom he had once discussed dreams and futures. A profound sorrow, different from his father's, gripped him. His was the grief of shared memory and severed paths. He broke away from his father's side and approached a small group standing at the edge of the road, their arms crossed, their expressions a mixture of pity and cynicism. He spoke not of divine wrath, but of logic. He gestured to the ark, a feat of engineering that defied their understanding, and asked them to consider the sheer, irrational faith required to build it. He appealed to their reason, to the part of them that must wonder, that must feel a sliver of doubt in their own certainty. He spoke of the changing quality of the light, the strange behavior of the animals, the deep, unsettling stillness in the world. He was not preaching, He was reasoning, his voice earnest, his eyes pleading for them to see, to understand, to choose life. His friends listened, but their hearts were calloused. One clapped him on the shoulder with a sad smile, calling him a good man led astray by a fanatical old father. Another joked that if it did rain, they would simply build their own boat. Their rejection was not violent, but it was absolute. They looked at Shem and saw a friend lost to a delusion, and in their pity they missed their own last chance. As they walked away, laughing softly and shaking their heads, Shem felt the terrible final click of a door shutting. The theme of missed opportunities hung in the air, as tangible as the dust kicked up by their departing feet. They had been given a sign, a warning, and a personal plea, and they had chosen, with a shrug and a joke, to remain outside. Shem turned back toward the ark, the weight of his saved life suddenly feeling immense and lonely. The final call had been made, echoing across the plain, and the only answer was the silence of a world that had already condemned itself. Chapter 10. Entering the ark. The appointed day dawned under a sky the color of tarnished silver, a flat metallic light that seemed to leach the vibrancy from the world. It was the 17th day of the second month of Noah's 600th year, a date etched into his soul not by a calendar, but by the silent, internal countdown that had governed his every waking moment for decades. The air itself felt different, thick, heavy, and charged with a strange waiting energy, as if the atmosphere were holding its breath. The open door of the ark, a massive dark rectangle in the vessel's side, no longer looked like an entrance, but like a threshold between two existences. The time for building, for gathering, for warning was over. Now there was only the act of entering. A complex tide of emotions washed over the family as they stood together for the last time on the unblemished earth. Fear was a cold knot in Noah's stomach, a primal tremor at the thought of the world being unmade around him. He looked at his wife, her face pale but serene, her hand finding his with a familiar, steadying pressure. In her eyes he saw not terror, but a resolute hope, a fierce trust in the promise that lay on the other side of the coming storm. His sons and their wives carried their own silent burdens, Shem's thoughtful gaze sweeping the horizon as if memorizing it, Ham's jaw tight with the effort of containing his anxiety, Japheth's youthful face alight with a nervous, almost exhilarated anticipation. They were leaving everything they had ever known to be sealed inside a wooden world, and the finality of the step was a weight they all shared. They moved in a solemn procession, their footsteps soft on the dry ground. Noah led the way, crossing the shadow of the doorframe and stepping into the dim, cavernous interior. The change was immediate and profound. The outside world, with its vast horizons and open sky, was replaced by the close, resin-scented air of the ark, a space that was both immense and confining. The sounds of the world were muffled, replaced by the rustling, snuffling, and chirping of the thousands of creatures already settled in their compartments, a living, breathing symphony of the preserved. The family fanned out, their movements purposeful as they began the final critical task of organizing their sanctuary. They checked the lashes on the great waterskins, ensured the mountains of stored grain and dried fruit were secure from pests and dampness, and verified that the channels for waste were clear. Every sack of feed, every jar of oil, every bundle of medicinal herbs was a thread in the tapestry of their survival, and their careful arrangement was an act of worship, a prayer for endurance. The animals, sensing the shift, were mostly calm, their divinely instilled peace a buffer against the rising human tension. The great cats lounged in their straw-filled pens, their tails twitching contentedly. The herds of clean animals, the sheep, goats, and cattle, chewed their cud with a placid rhythm. The air on the lower deck was warm and thick, with the smell of hay and healthy dung, a barn-like atmosphere that felt deceptively normal. On the middle deck, the smaller mammals and reptiles rested in their enclosures, while the upper decks were a cacophony of birdsong and the flutter of wings from the aviaries. The family moved among them all, their presence a soothing balm, their hands offering a final scoop of grain or a scratch behind the ear, a silent communion between the stewards and the stewarded. As the last of their personal belongings were stored and the final inspection was complete, a deep collective sigh seemed to pass through the family. They gathered near the center of the main deck, standing together in a small circle. The thematic focus on obedience was complete. Every command had been followed, every detail attended to with meticulous care. They had built the impossible, gathered the unimaginable, and now they had entered the sanctuary. The world outside, with all its violence and mockery, was about to be judged. But here, within the pitched walls of their obedience, they were safe. The ark was no longer just a vessel of wood and tar. It was a covenant-given form, a floating island of grace in a coming sea of wrath. The open door still framed a rectangle of the fading, eerie light, but inside a new kind of light was kindling, the quiet, steady flame of hope, burning in the hearts of 8 souls who had chosen to trust, and in the beating hearts of every creature they had been chosen to save. Chapter 11. The door shuts. The moment arrived, not with a fanfare of wind or a crack of lightning, but in a pocket of absolute stillness that descended upon the ark and the land surrounding it. The strange metallic light from the sky seemed to congeal, and the last whispers of the wind died away, leaving a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Inside the ark, the family stood together, their collective breath held, their gazes fixed on the vast rectangle of the open doorway, their last tenuous connection to the world they had known. Then a presence filled the space, not as a shape or a sound, but as a palpable shift in reality, a weight of intention that made the very air hum. It was a force that needed no hand, no mechanism, for the act was one of pure will. The massive door, a colossal slab of gopher wood and pitch that had taken weeks to craft and position, began to move. It did not groan on its hinges, for no human hand guided it. It slid across the opening with a soft, final grinding sound, a deep bass note that vibrated through the deck planks and up through the soles of their feet. The sound echoed in the cavernous hold, a single resonant note that seemed to swallow all other noise, the rustle of the animals, the beat of their own hearts. Then, with a definitive solid thud that felt like the closing of a tomb and the sealing of a womb simultaneously, it shut. The line of silver-gray light from the outside world vanished, plunging them into a darkness broken only by the flickering glow of their few oil lamps. They were sealed in, the work was done, the choice was irrevocable. A complex wave of emotion washed over the 8 souls in the dimness. The first and most immediate was a staggering relief, a release of a tension that had been building for a century. The taunts, the labor, the uncertainty, it was all over. The door was shut, and they were safe. The divine protection they had been promised was now a tangible reality, a wooden wall between them and the judgment to come. Noah felt his shoulders, which had carried the weight of the command for so long, finally drop. His wife let out a soft, shuddering sigh, her body leaning into his for support. The sons looked at one another, their faces in the lamplight showing the same dawning comprehension. They had done it. They had obeyed, and they were saved. But the relief was swiftly followed by a profound, sobering solemnity. The finality of that sound settled upon them, a mantle of grave responsibility. The echo of the shut-in door was not just a sound of safety, it was the sound of an ending. It was the sound of the last chance for the world outside expiring. They were not just survivors. They were the sole inheritors of a drowned earth, the only repositories of its memory and the only hope for its future. The immense, silent darkness of the ark seemed to press in on them, a physical representation of the isolation that was now their reality. They were a tiny island of life in a soon-to-be endless ocean, and the weight of that knowledge was crushing in its solemnity. From beyond the thick, pitched walls, the last sounds of the old world filtered through, faint and distorted. They were not the sounds of mockery any more. The laughter had ceased. Now there were cries, sharp, disbelieving wails of terror and sudden, horrified understanding. A man's voice, ragged with panic, shouted something unintelligible, followed by the sound of fists beating uselessly against the impregnable hull. A woman's scream, high and thin, was cut off abruptly. These were the final, desperate utterances of a humanity that had refused to believe, now faced with the undeniable truth. The family inside stood in silence, listening to the death throes of their entire civilization. There was no triumph in their hearts, only a deep, aching sorrow for the multitudes on the other side of the wall. The themes of divine protection and finality were now inextricably linked. They were safe because he had shut the door, and the world was lost because that same door would not open again. The last cries faded, swallowed by the same immense silence that had preceded the door's movement, leaving the family alone in the lamplit dark with the beating of their own hearts and the gentle, trusting sounds of the animals, the only sounds left in the world. Chapter 12, The Rain Begins. It began not as a sprinkle or a shower, but as a single percussive drumbeat on the ark's roof, a deep, resonant thud that echoed through the wooden cavern. A moment of silence followed, thick with anticipation, and then another drop struck, and another, until the sound became a relentless roaring tattoo, a million hammers beating a frantic rhythm against the pitch-sealed planks. The rain was not falling. It was being unleashed, a solid, shuddering curtain of water that seemed to have no space between its drops. At the same moment, a deeper, more terrifying sound emerged, a low, grinding groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the earth. The fountains of the great deep were breaking apart, vast subterranean reservoirs of water rupturing through the crust, vomiting their ancient hidden contents into the world. The sky wept, and the earth bled, and between them they conspired to wash the world clean. Inside the ark, the family huddled together, the world outside reduced to a symphony of fury. The roar of the rain was a constant, deafening white noise, broken by the deeper, booming concussions of the erupting aquifers. The ark, which had felt so solid and immense on dry land, now seemed terrifyingly small, a wooden nutshell tossed into the heart of a cataclysm. It shuddered and groaned as the waters began to rise, the timbers protesting as they took their first unsteady weight. Lamps, hung from the central beams, swung in wild, frantic arcs, casting leaping, distorted shadows that danced with the panic of the storm. The air grew thick and humid, heavy with the scent of wet wood, animal musk, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Noah moved to the small, high window they had constructed, sealed with a thick, translucent membrane. He pressed his face against it, but could see nothing. The world was a seething gray chaos, a vision of pure, elemental wrath. He could feel the ark shift, a sickening sideways lurch as the rising torrents began to lift it from its foundations. For a terrifying moment it listed, and the family braced themselves against the walls, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Then, with a great groaning sigh, the vessel righted itself, buoyant and stable, and they felt the profound, disorienting sensation of floating. They were no longer on the earth, but on its grave, a tiny, sealed world afloat on a boiling ocean. The theme of refuge was no longer a promise, but a desperate, physical reality, a fragile sanctuary in the heart of the deluge. Outside, the panic was absolute. The rising waters were not a gentle flood, but a violent, churning assault. Torrents ripped through the valleys, tearing trees from their roots and scouring the soil down to bare rock. The jeering crowds, the indifferent merchants, the mocking friends, all were caught in the same relentless surge. Their cries, which had been so clear and sharp against the hull moments before, were now muffled and swallowed by the roar of the water. They scrambled for high ground that was no longer high, clawed at cliffs that crumbled into the maelstrom, and watched in horror as the world they knew was systematically dismantled around them. The cataclysm was not a passive drowning, but an active, violent erasure. The rising water was a liquid scythe, cutting down everything in its path, and the ark, with its single, sealed door, was the only thing that remained unmoved, a stark, black monument to the faith that had built it and the judgment that had come. Chapter 13. 40 Days and Nights. The deluge settled into a rhythm, a relentless, percussive monotony that became the new heartbeat of the world. For 40 days and 40 nights the rain did not cease, nor did its intensity wane. It was a waterfall from the sky, an unending cataract that hammered the ark's roof with a sound like 1,000 constant drums, drowning out all but the loudest noises from within. The world outside the single sealed window was a uniform, churning gray, a formless void of water and mist where landmarks and horizons had been utterly erased. The ark was no longer a ship on a sea, but a speck adrift in a universe of furious falling water, its existence defined by the narrow wooden boundaries of divine instruction. Inside, life became a ritual of endurance, a carefully maintained routine against a backdrop of apocalypse. Noah and his family moved through the dim, lamp-lit decks with a weary, practiced grace. Their days were structured around the needs of their vast, living cargo. The sons, their muscles remembering the rhythms of their labor, would haul great bundles of hay and measured scoops of grain, their movements economical and precise. The women moved along the rows of enclosures with water skins and baskets of fruit, their gentle presence a calming influence on the restless animals. The air was thick with the smell of damp straw, animal breath, and the pungent, reassuring scent of the cedar wood itself. This daily stewardship was their anchor, a tangible purpose that kept the terrifying reality of their situation at bay. In the careful distribution of food and the cleaning of stalls, they found a semblance of normality, a thread of sanity woven through the chaos. Each evening, as the unseen sun abandoned the drowned world, the family would gather for prayer. The sound of Noah's voice, a low, steady murmur, would rise above the din of the rain, weaving a tapestry of supplication and gratitude. He gave thanks for their preservation, for the stability of the ark, for the health of the animals. He prayed for strength to endure the seemingly endless trial, for the faith to trust in a promise they could no longer see. These prayers were not just words. They were the spiritual maintenance of their tiny world, as vital as the physical care of the creatures. They were a declaration that, though surrounded by divine wrath, they were still held in divine hands. Through the single window, during fleeting moments when the torrent seemed to lighten to a mere downpour, they could glimpse the horrifying transformation of the earth. The waters were not still, but a raging, coffee-colored soup, carrying a ghastly flotsam of splintered trees, broken pottery, and the bloated, unrecognizable forms of the world that was. They saw the last skeletal fingers of the highest hills vanish beneath the roiling surface one by one, until there was nothing but a heaving, endless ocean stretching to a sky that was itself a sea. Shem would often stand there longest, his face a mask of somber reflection, contemplating the absolute finality of the justice being meted out. He saw not a vengeful act, but a surgical one, the cutting away of a diseased limb to save the whole body of creation. Ham would look upon the same scene and feel a fierce protective surge for his family within their wooden shell, his resolve hardening like the pitch in the seams. Japheth felt a profound, wordless sorrow for the lost beauty, the green valleys, the soaring cliffs, all now entombed in the deep. Their reflections were a silent conversation with the end of the world, a meditation on the terrifying cost of a fresh start, the thematic elements of endurance and divine wrath playing out in the endless drumming on the roof and the silent, solemn faces watching the last of the land disappear. Chapter 14. The world submerged, the last of the mountains. The ancient snow-capped peaks that had once scraped the belly of the sky were now no more than dark, fleeting stains beneath the churning surface. The waters, having consumed every valley, forest, and city, now mounted their final assault on the very bones of the earth. From the small, high window of the ark, Noah watched as the last stubborn crest of Ararat, a place of legends and eagles' nests, was slowly, inexorably swallowed. A great bubble of air escaped from some submerged cavern, bursting on the surface with a final gasping sigh, and then there was only the unbroken, heaving plain of the deep. The world was gone. Every field where a child had played, every riverbank where lovers had met, every stone altar and every den of iniquity, all of it was entombed beneath a mile of dark, restless water. The last vestige of land life, from the soaring hawk to the burrowing worm, had perished, its breath extinguished in the cold, silent dark. The ark now floated utterly alone, a single sealed casket adrift on an infinite liquid grave. Noah did not move from the window for a long time. his knuckles white where they gripped the wooden frame. His wife came to stand beside him, her presence a quiet warmth in the chill that seemed to have seeped into the ark from the drowned world outside. Together they gazed upon the absolute void. There were no more cries, no more signs of struggle, only the ceaseless slosh of waves against the hull and the hiss of rain on the roof, the only sounds left in all of creation. The destruction was complete, a canvas wiped utterly clean. The justice was as absolute as the silence that followed it, a terrifying demonstration of a holiness that could not abide the corruption it had purged. Later, gathered in the dim light of a single lamp, the family spoke in hushed, somber tones. The conversations were not of triumph, but of a heavy, awe-struck grief. Shem, his voice barely a whisper, wrestled with the terrifying scale of it. He spoke of justice, of a world so saturated with evil that this was the only possible surgical remedy. It was a righteous judgment, a divine necessity, yet the sheer totality of the obliteration was a weight on his soul. Ham, more pragmatic, felt the stark reality of their own preservation. He voiced the unspoken question that hung in all their hearts. Why them? Why were they mere mortals chosen to be the sole witnesses to the end of all things? It was a mercy so vast it felt like a burden, a grace that highlighted the utter deprivation of the world they had left behind. Noah listened, his own heart a turmoil of sorrow and sober understanding. He had obeyed, he had built, he had warned, but witnessing the final act was a different kind of trial. He sought a mercy not just in their salvation, but in the finality of the judgment itself. The suffering of the wicked was not prolonged. The world's agony was swift and total. The mercy was in the clean slate, the chance for a new beginning untainted by the old rot. It was a severe mercy, a love that would rather unmake its creation than let it suffer in its own self-inflicted torment for eternity. Their somber discussions wove these threads together, the unyielding thread of divine justice that demanded the flood and the golden, inexplicable thread of mercy that had provided the ark. They were afloat on both, prisoners of the judgment and beneficiaries of the grace, their tiny vessel the only point of intersection in a universe of water and wrath. The ark floated on, a speck of wood and hope in the heart of nothingness, its isolation a testament to a world that had been and a silence that promised someday to be broken. Chapter 15. Life in Confinement. The world was water, and their world was wood. A new strange existence had settled upon the 8 souls and their animal charges, an existence defined by the constant, gentle rocking of the ark and the close, humid air that smelled of hay, damp timber, and the musky breath of 1,000 different lives. The initial terror of the storm had subsided, replaced by the grinding reality of confinement. A daily rhythm of survival played out within the creaking pitch-black walls of their floating sanctuary. Each dawn, recognized only by the faint lightning at the high window, marked the beginning of a meticulous, unvarying schedule, a dance of duty designed to keep both chaos and despair at bay. The day began with the cacophony of the animal kingdom, a symphony of needs that could not be ignored. Lowings, bleatings, chirps, and roars echoed through the 3 decks, a living clock that demanded a response. Noah and his sons would descend into the dimly lit holds, their movements practiced and efficient. The feeding was a monumental task, a carefully orchestrated distribution of grain, hay, and stored forage. Ham, his strength a vital asset, would heave great bundles from the storage areas, while Shem, with his thoughtful precision, ensured the rations were measured fairly, the clean animals receiving their due portion and the unclean theirs. Japheth, nimble and quick, would scramble to the upper aviaries to scatter seed for the doves and ravens, his whistle a soft counterpoint to the frantic flutter of wings. The women moved through the narrower passages with water skins, their steps light, their voices a soothing murmur as they filled stone troughs, their gentle hands checking for signs of distress or illness among the smaller creatures. After the morning feeding came the cleaning, a less glorious but equally vital ritual. The removal of soiled straw and waste was a constant battle against filth and disease. The air would grow thick with the scent of ammonia and fresh bedding as they worked, forking out the muck and spreading clean, dry straw in its place. It was back-breaking, monotonous work, but in its necessity they found a shared purpose. A spilled water bucket became a minor crisis, a clogged drainage channel a puzzle to be solved together. These small challenges forged a quiet camaraderie, a wordless understanding that passed between them as they worked side by side. They were a single organism, each member a vital limb in the body of their survival. In the relative quiet of the afternoons, when the animals were fed and the stalls were clean, the weight of their isolation pressed in most heavily. The world outside was a featureless, heaving gray, and the inside of the ark was the entirety of their universe. To pass the time and keep their spirits from fraying, they turned to family. Noah's wife would often gather the women to mend clothing or replat worn ropes, their hands busy while they shared memories of the world that was, the taste of a certain fruit, the scent of rain on dry earth, the shape of a particular mountain against the sky. These reminiscences were not spoken with despair, but with a bittersweet reverence, a way of honoring what had been lost and affirming the value of what they carried forward. The men, meanwhile, would often sit together, sharpening tools that had no use, or simply listening to the sounds of the ark. It was during these long, quiet hours that moments of tension could surface, the strain of their impossible situation bubbling up from the depths. Ham's frustration would sometimes flash, a sharp word over a misplaced tool or a criticism of the day's rationing. Japheth's youthful energy, with no horizon to run toward, would turn to a restless pacing that grated on the nerves. But Noah's calm presence was a steadying force. He would not chastise, but would redirect, pointing out the steady health of the animals or the unwavering solidity of the hull, tangible proofs of God's provision. Shem, with his quiet wisdom, would often diffuse a brewing argument with a philosophical observation, reminding them that their confinement was not a prison sentence, but a gestational period for a new world. Specific challenges tested their resolve and ingenuity. A pregnant ewe went into a difficult labor, and the family took turns through the night, their worry a palpable thing in the lamplight, until a healthy lamb stumbled to its feet. A family of monkeys, growing restless, learned to unlatch their enclosure, leading to a frantic whispered chase through the shadowy decks that ended not with anger, but with relieved laughter, as the escapees were returned. These incidents, though stressful, reinforced their interdependence. They were shepherds, veterinarians, and custodians of a fragile, floating biosphere, and every challenge overcome was a victory against a void outside. As evening drew its veil, the family would gather once more, the thematic currents of isolation and hope swirling together in the dimness. The isolation was a physical fact, a crushing loneliness for the lost human chorus. But their hope was a quieter, stronger force, nurtured in the daily acts of care, in the soft nuzzle of a goat, in the trusting eyes of a child yet to be born, and in the unwavering belief that the endless water was not the end of the story, but the blank page upon which a new one would be written. Their life in confinement was a long, slow lesson in trust, a testament to the fact that even in the heart of the great deep, the routines of care and the bonds of family could create a world of its own, a world waiting for the command to bloom again. Chapter 16, The Long Float. The rain had ceased, its final drumbeat on the roof replaced by an unnerving, hollow silence that was somehow more oppressive than the storm's roar. The ark was now adrift on a global sea, a featureless expanse of lead-gray water that stretched to a horizon indistinguishable from the sky. The initial 40 days of cataclysm had given way to a new phase of their trial, the long, monotonous float. 150 days stretched before them, a seemingly endless procession of identical sunrises and sunsets marked only by the gentle, ceaseless rocking of their wooden world. The frantic energy of survival had ebbed, replaced by a grinding sameness that tested the very fabric of their faith. The sheer, unchanging emptiness outside the window became a mirror for the doubt that sometimes threatened to bloom in the quiet corners of their hearts. Noah felt the spiritual weight of this stagnation more than anyone. He watched his family move through their daily routines with a quiet weariness, their faces etched with the strain of confinement and the haunting memory of the world's final screams. He saw how the endless water could erode hope, how the silence could amplify fear. In response, he fortified their days with ritual. Each morning and evening, he gathered them together in the dim light of the central deck, their 8 voices rising in prayer. These were not the desperate pleas for deliverance from the storm, but quieter, more profound petitions for endurance, for patience, for the strength to trust in a timing they could not see or comprehend. He led them in, reciting the promises spoken to him in a vision, painting with words the picture of a new earth, green and washed clean, a world where their feet would once again touch solid ground. His faith became a bulwark against the creeping despair, a constant, gentle reminder that they were not merely drifting, but being carried. In this shared, protracted struggle, the family's bonds, already strong, were tempered into something unbreakable. They had no one but each other. The petty tensions that had surfaced in the early days of confinement now melted away in the face of the vast, watery solitude. They learned to read each other's moods in the set of a shoulder or the sigh in the darkness. Shem's quiet contemplation became a source of solace. His ability to find meaning in the smallest things, the pattern of grain in the wood, the complex social order of an ant colony they had inadvertently brought aboard, a balm for restless spirits. Ham's steadfast strength was a pillar they could all lean on. His practical competence in solving a broken hinge or a leaking trough a testament to their resilience. Japheth's youthful optimism, though dimmed, would still occasionally flare, sparking a game with the younger animals or a story that made them all smile. The wives found strength in their shared duties and their whispered hopes for the future. their hands often linked in a silent promise as they worked. Their shared struggles became the threads that wove them into a single soul. A fever that swept through the family, leaving them weak and shivering in the damp chill, saw them nursing each other with a tenderness that transcended blood. The day the water stores tasted faintly of tar became a collective problem to be solved, their minds working together to devise a new filtration system using layers of sand and cloth. When a sense of hopelessness would descend upon one, the others would instinctively gather closer, offering the simple physical comfort of their presence, a shared meal, or a renewed prayer. They were a tiny island of humanity in an ocean of oblivion, and their survival depended not just on the food they had stored or the strength of their hull, but on the love they nurtured within it. The thematic focus on patience and trust was a daily discipline, a conscious turning away from the temptation to count the days with despair. They learned to measure time not by the calendar, but by the small incremental changes within their world. The growth of a lamb into a young ram, the molting of a bird's feathers, the gradual softening of the light at the window as the water's surface finally began to calm. They trusted that the same hand that had shut the door was guiding their drift, that the same voice that had commanded the flood was counting the days of their float. The long, monotonous journey became a crucible, burning away the last remnants of their old lives and forging them into the founders of the new, their faith no longer a fiery certainty, but a deep, slow-burning ember of trust in the unseen, perfect timing of God. Chapter 17. God remembers the change began not as a sight, but as a sensation, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the very substance of air. For 150 days, the ark had been a passive prisoner of the currents, drifting on a sea so vast and featureless it felt like eternity itself. The silence had been a heavy blanket, broken only by the lap of water against the hull and the familiar confined sounds of life within. But then a new sound whispered through the high window, a sound that had been absent for so long it took a moment for Noah's mind to register it. It was the sound of wind, not the shrieking gale of the storm, but a steady, purposeful breath moving across the face of the deep. It was a sound of intention, a whisper of a mind at work in the void. Noah, who had been praying in the dimness, felt his words catch in his throat. He lifted his head, his old bones aching as he rose and moved toward the source of the sound. He pressed his face to the translucent membrane of the window, his heart hammering a new, frantic rhythm against his ribs. The view was the same unbroken gray, but the quality of the movement had changed. The chaotic, heaving swells were being combed into long, rolling waves, their peaks whipped into froth by the persistent wind. And then he felt it, a slight but definite change in the ark's motion. For months, their world had been a constant, nauseating sway, but now the vessel seemed to steady itself, its rocking becoming less pronounced, its drift more purposeful. It was as if a great, invisible hand had settled upon its hull, stilling its wanderings. The sensation was so subtle, so fragile, but to Noah it was as profound as the first hammer blow on the cypress tree. It was the first physical evidence of a promise being kept, a divine memory stirring in the heart of the deluge, a hope so long buried under the weight of endless water and monotonous days, flared to life within him, bright and painful. It was not the boisterous hope of a journey's end, but a quiet, trembling certainty that the long, silent vigil was finally over. He turned from the window, his face transformed, the deep lines of worry and endurance seeming to soften in the lamplight. He did not shout the news, but walked slowly to where his wife sat mending a torn sack, her head bowed in weary resignation. He laid a hand on her shoulder, and she looked up, her eyes reading the truth in his before he could form a word. A slow, tremulous smile broke across her face, and she placed her hand over his, their silent communication a testament to a lifetime of shared faith and shared burdens. The simple touch conveyed everything God had remembered. He had not forgotten them in their wooden prison. The wind was his breath, and the steadying of the ark was his promise in motion. The news spread through the family like a cleansing rain, washing away the grime of despair that had settled upon their spirits. Shem, upon hearing it, closed his eyes, his lips moving in a silent prayer of gratitude so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Ham, who had borne the physical strain of their survival with a grim determination, felt a knot of tension in his shoulders loosen for the first time in months, a slow, deep breath filling his lungs. Japheth, whose youthful energy had been stifled by the confinement, felt a surge of exhilaration. His mind already races toward the future, toward solid ground and opened skies. The daughters-in-law clasped hands, their faces alight with a renewed fierce joy, their thoughts turning from mere survival to the promise of homes and children in a world reborn. That evening, their gathering for prayer was different. The air, which had so often been thick with petitions for endurance and pleas for a sign, was now charged with a vibrant, thankful energy. Noah's voice, when he spoke, was strong and clear, no longer a murmur in the dark, but a proclamation of grace. He gave thanks for the wind, for the steadying of the ark, for the divine remembrance that had not been earned, but freely given. He praised the mercy that had sealed them in, and the same mercy that was now beginning to unveil their deliverance. Their prayers were no longer just about waiting. They were about preparing, about the gratitude that flows from a rescued heart. The theme of divine remembrance was not a cold theological concept, but a warm, living reality. The turning of a divine face toward them once more, the sure and certain knowledge that they were seen, known, and not abandoned. The wind continued to blow outside, a constant soothing hymn against the hull, and inside, surrounded by the trusting sounds of the animals and the beating hearts of his family, Noah felt a peace deeper than any he had known since the door had shut. The judgment was past. The long float was ending. The grace that had provided the ark was now guiding it home. Chapter 18, the ark rests. The first sign was not a sight, but a sound, a low grinding shudder that vibrated through the very bones of the ark, a deep, resonant groan of wood meeting unyielding stone after its long, weightless drift. The gentle, ceaseless rocking that had been the rhythm of their world for months suddenly ceased, replaced by a profound, startling stillness. The vessel listed slightly, then held firm, cradled by something solid and immovable beneath the endless sea. The sensation was so alien, so jarring after the long float, that for a moment the entire family froze in their tasks, their eyes wide, their breath held, listening to the new, absolute silence that followed the impact. The great wooden mountain which had been their prison and their salvation had come to rest. The long, watery journey was over, a celebration quiet and profound, bloomed in the dimness. It was not a riotous affair, but a slow dawning realization that spread from face to face, a shared, incredulous joy that needed no shouts to be heard. Noah's wife let out a soft, shuddering cry, her hands flying to her mouth as tears, held back for so long, finally traced paths through the grime on her cheeks. Shem closed his eyes, a slow smile spreading across his face as he offered a silent, fervent prayer of thanks. Ham let out a great, explosive breath, the tension of 150 days of vigilance, finally releasing from his massive frame. Japheth, unable to contain the surge of emotion, let out a whoop of pure, undiluted relief that echoed through the decks, startling the animals into a momentary chorus of answering calls. They embraced one another, their grips tight, their bodies trembling with a hope that was now as solid as the ground beneath their feet. It was the first tangible sign of land, of a future, of a world that was not forever water. In the days that followed, the high window became the focal point of their existence. They took turns pressing against its thick membrane, their breath fogging the surface as they strained to see. The wind sent by God continued to blow, and as it swept across the face of the waters, it began to peel back the veil. The featureless gray began to break apart, revealing glimpses of dark, jagged peaks piercing the surface like the teeth of a submerged leviathan. They were the mountains of Ararat, their slopes streaming with waterfalls, their crowns now islands in a shrinking sea. The family watched, mesmerized as the waters continued to recede, the process agonizingly slow but undeniably real. Each day revealed a little more, a rocky ridge here, a sodden valley there. They charted the retreating tide, their fingers tracing the emerging landscape on the dusty planks of the deck, plotting the slow, miraculous resurrection of the earth. This new phase required a different kind of faith, a patient, watchful trust. The frantic labor of survival eased, replaced by a quiet, anticipatory vigilance. The thematic elements of salvation and new beginnings were no longer abstract promises, but realities unfolding before their very eyes. The salvation had been their preservation in the ark. The new beginning was this gradual unveiling of a world washed clean, its scars still raw, but its potential limitless. They began to speak in hushed, hopeful tones of what came next. They discussed the logistics of disembarkation, of how to safely release the teeming life back onto the fertile mud, of where they might build their first home. The plotting of their next steps was an act of faith in itself, a commitment to the future that God was revealing day by day. They were no longer just survivors waiting for an end. They were pioneers gazing at the map of a new world, their hearts beating in time with the slow, steady recession of the waters. Each revealed stone a testament to the promise that had carried them through the flood. Chapter 19. The raven's flight, the waiting, had become a new kind of trial, a test of patience after the test of survival. The ark was grounded, a fortress beached on the high slopes of Ararat. But the world outside its walls remained a vast, watery graveyard, its secrets hidden beneath a surface that was only now beginning to betray the contours of the drowned earth. From the high window, the view was one of desolate beauty. Dark, rain-washed peaks, piercing a gray, misty sky, and between them, valleys filled not with life, but with churning, silt-laden water. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of moisture from the eaves and the distant cry of the wind. It was a world in limbo, caught between the cataclysm and the new creation, and the family within the ark felt the tension of that in-between space in their very bones. Noah, his face etched with the lines of 100 years of obedience, felt a new restlessness stirring. The divine command to build was complete, the preservation was assured, but now a human curiosity, a need for a sign, began to gnaw at him. He needed to know if the earth could once again sustain life, if the mud below held a promise of roots and renewal. His gaze fell upon the ravens, a pair of glossy black birds with intelligent, piercing eyes, housed in a cage near the window. They were creatures of the wild, scavengers who could range far and wide, who knew the secrets of land and air. A plan, simple and born of this newfound urgency, formed in his mind. He would send out a scout, a winged emissary, to probe the silence of the drowned world. With gentle, deliberate hands, he opened the cage and selected the male raven, its feathers a sheen of captured darkness. The bird hopped onto his wrist, its weight familiar and trusting. Noah carried it to the small, high window, unsealing the protective membrane that had kept the storm at bay for so long. A rush of cool, damp air flooded in, carrying the scent of whetstone and vast open spaces. For a moment, the raven perched on the sill, its head cocked, its jet-black eyes scanning the incomprehensible vista of water and rock. Then, with a powerful thrust of its wings, it launched itself into the void. The family watched, their breath held, as the black shape dwindled against the immense gray canvas of the sky, a single dark question mark written against the silence. They waited. Hours bled into a day, and then another. Their routines continued, the feeding, the cleaning, the prayers. But now every sound from outside was scrutinized, every shadow at the window a cause for a frisson of hope. And then, on the evening of the second day, a familiar shape appeared, circling the ark before alighting clumsily on the ridgepole, its feathers ruffled and damp. The raven had returned, but it brought no sign, carried no sprig of green in its beak. It simply perched there, a dark sentinel, before taking wing again, disappearing into the mist. This pattern repeated itself over the following days. The raven would fly out, a symbol of their yearning, only to return each time, its flights becoming a restless, purposeless rhythm between the ark and the featureless waters. It found no place to perch, no dry land on which to rest its feet, only the endless heaving waves and the slick, waterlogged carcasses of drowned trees. It was a creature of the air and the ark, trapped between the two, its endless comings and goings a mirror of their own suspended existence. In the dim, lamp-lighted interior, the family gathered to discuss the meaning of the raven's fruitless flights. The conversations were hushed, tinged with a renewed uncertainty. Shem, the contemplative one, saw in the bird's behavior a profound metaphor. The raven, he suggested, was a creature of the old world, a scavenger, comfortable with death and decay. Perhaps its inability to find a resting place signified that the earth was not yet ready for life, that the processes of purification were still underway, that the death of the old order was not yet complete. Its returns to the ark were a reminder that their sanctuary was still their only home, that the time for exodus had not yet come. Ham, ever practical, focused on the literal meaning. The raven found no dry land. It was as simple and as disappointing as that. The waters were receding, yes, but the earth was still a sodden sponge, unable to offer sustenance or stability. Its flights were not a failure, but a data point, a clear indication that they must wait, that their patience, so deeply tested on the water, was now being tested on the rock. Japheth, whose hope had soared at the sight of the mountains, felt a keen disappointment. He had imagined a raven finding a sun-drenched branch, a symbol of immediate renewal. Its empty returns felt like a postponement of the joy he had so eagerly anticipated. Noah listened to them all, his own heart a mixture of understanding and a quiet, persistent faith. The raven's flight was not a divine message of despair, but a lesson in divine timing. The uncertainty was part of the process. The waiting was an active state of trust, not a passive resignation. The bird's restless pattern was a testament to the fact that some signs are given not to provide answers, but to deepen the questions, to refine the hope that waits for the right sign at the right time. The themes of uncertainty and waiting were woven into the very fabric of their days, as tangible as the raven's black feathers and as vast as the silent receding sea outside. They were learning that deliverance was not a single event, but a slow unfolding, and that sometimes the most profound act of faith was to watch a bird fly out and return with nothing, and to believe that its next flight might be different. Chapter 20. The First Dove. The raven's restless, fruitless flights had painted a stark picture of a world still gripped by the flood's aftermath, a realm of water and death where no foothold for life could yet be found. Its dark, circling form had become a symbol of their prolonged suspension, a creature of the void that could find no purchase on the new earth. But Noah's hope, though tempered, was not extinguished. He turned his gaze from the raven, the scavenger of the old order, to a different kind of messenger. In a quiet cage near the window, a pair of doves cooed softly, their feathers a soft gray, their eyes gentle and trusting. Where the raven was a creature of carrion and shadows, the dove was a symbol of peace, of innocence, of a creation that yearned for the olive branch and the fresh leaf. Its nature was not to circle the dead, but to seek out the living. On a morning when the wind had stilled to a whisper and the surface of the waters lay like polished lead, Noah made his choice. He reached into the cage and carefully gathered the female dove into his cupped hands. She was light, a mere breath of warmth and life against his work-roughened palms. He carried her to the window, the family gathering silently behind him, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension. The air that flowed into the ark was cool and carried the faint, clean scent of rain-washed stone. Noah extended his hands through the opening, and for a moment the dove rested there, a compact bundle of potential. Then, with a flutter of wings that was soft and purposeful, unlike the raven's powerful thrust, she launched herself into the vastness. She did not circle the ark in restless, searching arcs, but flew straight and true, a small gray speck diminishing into the immense gray distance, a single note of purity, seeking a harmony in the silence. The wait for the dove was different from the wait for the raven. It was not marked by the expectation of a restless, temporary return, but by a fragile, burgeoning hope for a definitive sign. They watched the empty horizon, their prayers a silent, collective yearning. The day stretched on, the light unchanging in the cloud-diffused sky. Their chores felt perfunctory, their minds and hearts tethered to that single high window. The dove's mission felt more significant, more delicate. It was not sent to confirm the presence of death, but to discover the first whisper of life. As the day began to wane, its light softening to a deep pewter, a small familiar shape appeared, growing steadily larger against the sky. The dove was returning. A collective intake of breath swept through the family as they pressed closer to the window. Their eyes searched the approaching form, straining for a glimpse of green, for the triumphant sprig of an olive leaf clutched in her beak. But as she drew nearer, her flight weary and direct, they saw it, or rather, they saw its absence. Her beak was empty. Her feet, when she alighted on the sill with a soft, exhausted coo, were clean. She had found no dry land, no emerging tree, no promise of renewal. She had flown across the face of the waters and found only more water. A palpable wave of disappointment washed through the ark, a cold tide following the receding warmth of their hope. Japheth, who had most vividly imagined the dove's triumphant return, turned away, his youthful face clouded with a frustration he could not voice. Ham let out a slow, heavy sigh, the sound of practical acceptance. Shem's thoughtful eyes held a deeper sorrow, not for themselves, but for the earth, still trapped beneath its liquid shroud. Noah carefully gathered the tired dove back into her cage, his hands gentle. He felt the sting of unmet expectation, the human desire for a clear and immediate answer. The dove's empty return was a silent testimony that the earth's rebirth was a process, not an event, and that their vigil was not yet over. Yet, in the quiet that followed, a different emotion began to surface, one that had been forged in the long months of the float: patience. The disappointment was real, but it did not breed despair. Noah looked at the dove, safely resting now, and saw not a failure, but a completed mission. She had gone, she had searched, and she had returned. Her empty beak was not a symbol of hopelessness, but a data point on a divine timeline. It meant, not yet. It meant that the work of the wind upon the waters was ongoing, that the depths were still receding, that the seeds of the new world were still germinating in the deep, fertile mud below. The plot point of continued vigilance was reinforced. They must watch, they must wait, they must trust. The first dove had not brought the olive leaf, but she had brought them a lesson in a quiet, persistent faith that endures even when the sign is delayed, the faith that knows the story is not over because a single chapter ends without the hoped-for resolution. Chapter 21, The Olive Leaf. The dove's return with an empty beak had been a lesson in deferred hope, a quiet instruction in the slow, deliberate pace of a world reborn. For 7 more days the family maintained their watch, their eyes tracing the retreating water lines on the emergent peaks of Ararat, their patience a practiced discipline. The air within the ark grew lighter, less burdened by the scent of confinement, and carried now the faint, promising aroma of wet earth and stone. On the morning of the 7th day, as a pale, tentative sun broke through the thinning clouds, Noah once again approached the dove's cage. This time, there was a different quality to his movements, not of desperate seeking, but of serene expectation, a calm trust that the right sign would come at the appointed hour. He cupped the dove in his hands, feeling the rapid, delicate beat of its heart against his skin. At the window, he released her, and she sprang into the air, a small gray arrow shot toward the promise of the new day. The family watched her flight, a collective stillness holding them as she dwindled into the vast open sky. The hours that followed were filled with the familiar routines, But beneath the surface of their chores ran a current of quiet anticipation. They moved with a lightness they had not known for months. Their conversations touched with a speculative hope about the world that was slowly being unveiled beyond their wooden walls. When the dove returned, her flight was not weary and direct, but purposeful and strong. She did not simply alight on the sill. She circled the ark once, a graceful, sweeping arc, before coming to rest. And in her beak she carried it, a single, fresh, vibrant olive leaf. It was a small thing, a trifle of green against the immense gray and brown of the resurrecting world, but its significance was colossal. It was not just a leaf, it was a covenant made visible, a testament that the waters had receded enough for the earth to begin its work of healing. The deep, fertile mud had yielded its first fruit, and the trees, though still submerged at their roots, were pushing forth new life into the cleansed air. A wave of pure, unadulterated joy swept through the family, so powerful it was almost physical force. Noah's wife let out a cry that was half laugh, half sob, her hands clasped to her chest as she stared at the small, perfect leaf. Shem's face, usually so composed, broke into a radiant smile, his eyes shining with the profound theological wonder of the moment. The symbol of peace returned from a world judged and now restored. Ham, the pragmatist, felt a fierce, exultant triumph, a validation of every back-breaking load and every pitch-stained day. He clapped his father on the shoulder, his grip firm and full of shared victory. Japheth, unable to contain his exhilaration, let out a joyful shout that echoed through the decks, a sound so full of life it seemed to startle even the animals into a chorus of approving calls. The daughters-in-law embraced, their laughter mingling with tears of relief and happiness, their minds already painting pictures of gardens and groves in the world outside. Noah carefully took the dove, his fingers gently prying the leaf from her beak. He held it in his palm, this tiny living banner of hope and renewal. It was soft, pliable, and smelled faintly and wonderfully of life, of sap and sunlight and the rich, dark soil from which it had sprung. This was the answer to their long vigil, the confirmation of every prayer whispered in the darkness. The thematic focus on hope, which had been a flickering lamp during the long float, now blazed like the sun. It was a hope confirmed, a promise fulfilled in the most delicate and profound way imaginable. The leaf was not just a sign that the earth was emerging, it was a guarantee that the future would be green, that the story of creation was beginning its second glorious chapter, and that they, the keepers of the seed, were witnessing the first tender shoot of a world reborn from the flood. Chapter 22. The dove departs. 7 more days of patient waiting followed the triumphant return of the dove, 7 days during which the small green olive leaf was passed from hand to hand, a living relic that infused the ark's dim interior with the palpable scent of the future. The leaf, though it began to wilt, remained a vibrant emblem in their minds, a promise etched not in words, but in the very fiber of life itself. The family's mood had shifted irrevocably. The grinding anxiety of the long float was now a distant memory, replaced by a buoyant, almost breathless anticipation. They watched from the window as the waters continued their slow, inexorable retreat, revealing more of the world's raw, new skeleton each day. Dark, wet rock giving way to patches of dark, fertile mud, and the lower slopes of Ararat emerging like the backs of great, slumbering beasts. On the morning of the 8th day, the air held a new crispness, a dry clarity it had not possessed since before the rain began. Noah returned to the dove's cage, his movements steady and sure. This time there was no question in his heart, no silent plea for a sign. This was a mission of confirmation, a final scouting report on a world he now believed was ready. He gathered the dove, feeling the familiar, trusting weight in his hands, and carried her to the window. The family gathered not with the tense hope of previous sendings, but with a quiet confidence. As Noah opened his hands, the dove burst forth, a swift gray streak against a sky that was now a clean, pale blue. She flew with a decisive purpose, her path straight and true, heading not for the nearest peaks, but toward the emerging valleys where the olive trees would be putting down their new roots into the softened earth. They watched her until she was a speck, and then until she was nothing at all, absorbed into the vastness of the reborn world. The hours passed, marked by the slow arc of the sun, a sight that itself felt like a miracle after the endless gray. They went about their duties, but their minds were outside the ark, following the dove's flight across the expanding landscape. They fed the animals and cleaned the pens, but their attention was divided, their ears straining for the soft rustle of returning wings. The sun climbed to its zenith and began its descent, painting the stark new mountains in shades of amber and rose. The evening shadows grew long, and the familiar time for the dove's return came and went. The window remained empty. The silence from the world outside was no longer the silence of death, but the profound, peaceful quiet of a land at rest. A deep, settled knowing bloomed within the ark. The dove was not coming back. She had found her home, a world of budding branches and dry land, of stillness and sustenance. Her failure to return was the greatest sign she could have given them. It was the final, unequivocal confirmation that the earth was drying, that the great deluge was truly over, and that the long confinement within their wooden sanctuary was nearing its end. A profound gratitude, warm and expansive, filled the space left by her absence. Noah felt it swell within his chest, a thankfulness not just for their preservation, but for the meticulous, patient guidance that had brought them to this moment. The command had been given, the ark built, the storm weathered, and now the promise was fulfilled. The earth was ready for them. With this certainty, a new, purposeful energy ignited within the family. Preparations to leave the ark began in earnest, no longer as a distant hope, but as an imminent reality. The character moments were filled with a bustling, joyful industry. Shem and Japheth began to compile detailed inventories of the remaining food and supplies, their voices lively with plans for the first days on land. Ham, his strength once again channeled toward a clear goal, started inspecting the great door, testing its seals and planning the mechanics of its opening, a task that felt as monumental as its closing had been. The women gathered their few personal belongings, the worn tools, the carefully preserved seeds, the cherished, simple items that had survived the flood, their hands trembling not with fear, but with a thrilling excitement. They spoke of the homes they would build, the gardens they would plant, the open skies under which their children would be born. Every action, every shared glance was imbued with a sense of profound gratitude and bright, shimmering anticipation for the world that awaited them just beyond the pitched walls. Chapter 23. waiting for dryness. The dove's failure to return had spoken the final unequivocal truth. The earth was drying, yet the command to leave the ark had not been given, and so Noah waited, his patience a deep, still pool after the long torrent of the flood. The great door remained shut, a sealed boundary between the world they had known for over a year and the world being reborn outside. From the high window, the view was no longer one of desolation, but of gradual, miraculous transformation. The waters had shrunk back, revealing a landscape both familiar and utterly alien. Valleys of deep, rich mud that steamed in the sunlight, skeletal forests of drowned trees standing like gray ghosts, and the soaring, stark peaks of Ararat, their stone flanks scrubbed clean by the deluge. The air that whispered through the opening was no longer heavy with the scent of decay, but carried the clean, mineral smell of wet stone and the faint, promising fragrance of damp earth warming under a sun that grew stronger with each passing day. Noah spent long hours at that window, his gaze a patient survey of the emerging land. He watched the patterns of the retreating water, noting how the mud cracked and fissured as it dried, how the first tenacious lichens were already painting silver-green patterns on the sun-bathed rocks. He saw the paths that the receding torrents had carved, new riverbeds waiting for the springs and rains of a new age. This was not the world he had left. That world was buried deep beneath the silt and the memory of the deep. This was a blank slate, a canvas of primordial potential, and the weight of being its first inhabitants settled upon him with a solemn gravity. His obedience, which had once been expressed in the swing of a hammer and the gathering of beasts, was now a quiet, internal state, a willingness to remain within the walls of salvation until the architect of this new world issued a command to step out. Within the ark, the family's discussions turned from survival to the profound responsibility of rebuilding life. The atmosphere was electric, with a contained excitement, a buzzing energy that had no immediate outlet. They gathered in the evenings, their voices hushed and earnest, speaking of the practicalities and the principles of the world they were about to inherit. Shem, his mind inclined toward order and covenant, spoke of establishing laws from the very beginning, of building a society rooted in the reverence that had saved them. He envisioned altars of thanksgiving and communities bound by a shared memory of both judgment and grace. Ham, his thoughts on the tangible, discussed the clearing of land, the felling of the dead forests for timber, the sowing of the precious seed they had carried through the flood. His was the vision of a homestead rising from the mud, of fields golden with grain, of the sweat and satisfaction of carving a home from the wilderness. Japheth's dreams were of exploration, of following the new rivers to their sources, of discovering the boundaries of this washed, clean earth. His wife spoke softly of children, of the first laughter that would echo in the silent valleys, of lullabies sung under a sky adorned with the same stars that had witnessed the world's end. Noah's wife, her hands forever busy, imagined her hearth, not the makeshift fire pot of the ark, but a true central fire around which generations would gather. Their discussions were woven through with the thematic threads of obedience and patience. They had the land before them, the promise fulfilled, yet they understood that their own timing was not to be trusted. To rush out upon an earth not fully prepared by the divine hand would be to repeat the arrogance of the old world. Their waiting was an active participation in the final stages of creation, a humble acknowledgement that they were not the masters of this new beginning, but its stewards, its first guests. Noah listened to them all, his heart full. He saw the faith of his sons tempered and strengthened in the long confinement, now ready to be applied to the task of building a civilization. He saw the hope in the eyes of the women, a hope that looked forward to life and growth, not back at loss and destruction. Their patience was not passive. It was a vigilant, trusting readiness. They cleaned and organized the ark's interior, not as a permanent home, but as a vessel they would soon leave behind. They prepared packs for the initial forays, sorted tools, and ensured the remaining animals were healthy and calm for their eventual release. Every action was performed with the quiet certainty that the command would come, that the door would open, and that their long vigil would end not with a desperate scramble, but with a solemn, grateful step onto the dry ground of a world redeemed. They waited, their obedience complete, their patience a final offering of faith before the dawn of their new lives. Chapter 24, Exodus from the Ark. The command, when it finally came, was not a voice thundering from the heavens or a vision searing the darkness, but a deep internal certainty that bloomed in Noah's heart like the first flower on the reborn earth. It was the 29th day of the second month of his 601st year, a date measured not by a calendar, but by the slow, patient unfurling of divine purpose. The air flowing through the high window was dry and sweet, carrying the scent of sun-warmed stone and the rich, fecund aroma of soil ready to receive life. The last vestiges of the flood had retreated, leaving behind a world glistening and new, its contours sharp against a sky of impossible, washed blue. The waiting was over. The time had come to leave the wooden womb that had cradled them through the end of all things. Noah moved to the great sealed door, the same door that had shut with such finality over a year before. His sons joined him, their faces set with a mixture of reverence and burgeoning excitement. Together, they set their shoulders against the massive slab of gopher wood and pitch. It did not groan open with ease, it resisted, as if reluctant to release its charges into the vastness of the new world. With a concerted heave, they pushed, and a crack of brilliant golden light split the darkness. The sound was a gasp, the ark's first breath of the outside world. They pushed again, and the door swung wide, flooding the dim interior with a light so intense it made them blink, their eyes aching after so long in the perpetual gloom. The first step out was a moment of profound, almost overwhelming sensory rebirth. Noah's foot, clad in worn leather, pressed down not on the familiar resonant planks of the deck, but onto soft, yielding earth. The sensation traveled up his leg, a shock of solidity and connection that made his knees tremble. The air, no longer filtered through a tiny window, filled his lungs, clean, cool, and vibrant, tasting of stone and distance and a purity that had been unimaginable in the world before the flood. The silence of the ark was replaced by a new, living quiet, broken only by the whisper of a gentle wind sweeping across the peaks of Ararat and the distant musical trickle of water finding its way down newborn streams. He stood there, rooted to the spot, his head thrown back, drinking in the immensity of the sky, a vast empty canvas awaiting the first brushstrokes of the new creation. One by one, the family emerged, their movements hesitant, like chicks leaving the nest for the first time. Noah's wife stumbled as her feet met the uneven ground, and she laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened joy that seemed to startle the very air. She knelt, her hands digging into the dark, moist soil, letting it sift through her fingers, her tears falling to water the earth that would become their home. Shem stood with his eyes closed, his face turned to the sun, feeling its warmth like a forgotten benediction on his skin. Ham immediately strode away from the ark, his powerful legs carrying him to a nearby outcrop, from which he surveyed the sweeping, empty valleys with a possessive, triumphant gaze, his chest swelling with the promise of labor and dominion. Japheth simply ran, his youthful energy finally unleashed, his whoops of exhilaration echoing off the stone faces of the mountains, a celebration of freedom after the long confinement. They did not venture far that first day. The world was too new, too vast, too raw. They stayed near the ark, their familiar fortress now beached and strange on the solid ground. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, they built their first fire on the open earth. The flames, dancing against the deepening twilight, were a declaration of permanence, a tiny, brave beacon in the heart of the immense, silent wilderness. They sat around it, the 8 of them, the only people in all the world, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. In the quiet that settled over them, the reflections began. Noah looked from face to face, his steadfast wife, his 3 strong sons, their capable wives, and his heart swelled with a gratitude so profound it was akin to pain. They were here. They had endured the mockery, the back-breaking labor, the terror of the storm, the grinding monotony of the float, and the agonizing patience of the wait. They had obeyed, and they had been saved. The journey had been one of utter reliance, of faith tested in the fire of cataclysm and refined in the water of the deep. The ark, looming behind them, was no longer just a ship, but a testament, a silent witness to the faithfulness that had built it and the grace that had filled it. The thematic elements of rebirth and gratitude intertwined like the smoke from their fire rising into the star-dusted sky. They were reborn not as infants, but as the elders of a new humanity, carrying the memory of the old world's failure and the responsibility for the new world's promise. And their gratitude was not just for their lives, but for the journey itself, for the purpose that had shaped them, for the unity that had sustained them, and for the profound, humbling mercy that had selected them to be the keepers of the second chance. They had stepped out of the ark and into history, their feet on the dry ground of a world washed clean, their hearts full of the silence and the space and the staggering, beautiful weight of a beginning. Chapter 25. Covenant and Rainbow, the first act of the new world, was not one of construction or conquest, but of gratitude. The vast silence of the reborn earth was broken not by the sound of a hammer or the shout of acclaim, but by the quiet, purposeful gathering of stones. Noah selected them with care, choosing unhewn rocks from the slopes of Ararat, their surfaces still cool and damp from the retreating waters. He carried them to a level place not far from the ark's great silent hulk, a sight that felt both exposed and sacred under the immense empty sky. His sons joined him, their movements reverent, understanding the significance of the task without needing to be told. Together, they built an altar, piling stone upon stone, until it formed a rough, sturdy platform that reached toward the heavens. The first human structure in a world washed clean, a monument not to man, but to the God who had saved him. From the preserved stocks of the clean animals, Noah selected a ram, a goat, and a bull. The creatures came willingly, their docility a lingering echo of the peace that had filled the ark. The act was solemn, a ritual of profound thanks that rose from the very core of his being. As the fire caught and the smoke began to curl upward, a rich, savory scent filled the clean air, an offering that was both a memorial of the judgment they had witnessed and a surrender of the first fruits of their deliverance. The family stood in a silent circle around the altar, their faces illuminated by the flames, their hearts a single, unified prayer of thanksgiving. The smoke rose in a straight, unwavering column, a thin gray thread connecting the raw new earth to the heavens, a message of gratitude from the saved to the Savior. And the answer came. It was not in a voice of thunder, but as a knowing that settled in Noah's spirit, a communication as clear and intimate as the one that had first commanded the ark's construction. The Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and spoke a promise into the heart of the man who had walked with him. It was a covenant, not just with Noah and his family, but with every living creature that had emerged with them from the wooden sanctuary. Never again would he curse the ground because of humanity. Never again would he strike down every living thing as he had done. The terrible rhythm of seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night, would not be broken by divine judgment. This was a promise of stability, a vow of restraint rooted in a divine understanding of the human heart. It was a covenant of grace, established not because the earth deserved it, but because God, in his mercy, willed it. As the last of the sacrificial smoke dissipated into the brightening sky, a miracle of light and water began to unfold. A soft, misting rain began to fall, the first since the deluge, but this was no storm of judgment. It was a gentle shower, each drop a prism catching the light of the emerging sun. And as the sun broke fully through the lingering clouds, its rays struck the countless falling droplets, weaving them into a colossal shimmering arch of color that spanned the entire horizon. It was a bow, but one without a string, a weapon of war unstrung and laid aside in the clouds. Its colors, vibrant crimson, brilliant gold, deep green, and serene violet, were painted across the sky with an artist's hand, a breathtaking spectacle of beauty emerging from the aftermath of wrath. Noah and his family looked up, their faces bathed in the rainbow's ethereal light. They witnessed the promise made visible, a sign as enduring as the covenant it represented. The bow was set in the clouds as a perpetual reminder, a seal on the contract between God and all flesh. Every time the clouds gathered, a potential symbol of coming judgment, this bow would appear, transforming the threat of storm into a guarantee of peace. It was a sign of divine mercy, a promise that the Creator's wrath had been satisfied and that his relationship with his creation was now founded on this unbreakable vow. The family stood in awe, the themes of redemption and divine mercy washing over them as palpably as the rainbow's colored light. They were not just survivors. They were witnesses to the reconciliation of heaven and earth, the first beneficiaries of a mercy that would outlast the mountains and the seas, a promise sealed not with a signature, but with a spectrum of light, a covenant of grace painted across the sky for all generations to come.